All right, we are going to Psalm 26 this evening. Psalm number 26. Okay, so our summary statement for Psalm 26. Psalm 26 appeals to God's justice with confidence that those who trust in Yahweh will be redeemed by His grace and finally stand in the congregation of the righteous. I'll go over that again. Psalm 26 appeals to God's justice with confidence that those who trust in Yahweh will be redeemed by His grace and finally stand in the congregation of the righteous. Okay, so for our simple outline for this psalm, 2 parts, verses 1 to 7, confessing innocence. Verses 8 to 12, requesting redemption. Let's go over that again. Verses 1 to 7, confessing innocence. Verses 8 to 12, requesting redemption. Okay, let's move on to our observations for Psalm 26. Psalm 26 was written by David. The superscription ascribes it to him, a psalm of David. There's no mention of any occasion. There is no musical direction or anything like that that is given. And really within the text of the psalm itself, we don't have a lot of idea as far as occasion goes. There is a mention of some enemies, though not that word in particular, but some of some wicked men that he doesn't want to be associated with. But we really don't have any clear idea of the occasion that this psalm was written. Psalm 26 is what I would call a prayer psalm, and that's not very specific. A lot of them are prayer psalms, but it doesn't really fit into any of the particular prayer psalm types. It does have elements of lament, and that would put it in some ways with psalms like Psalm 7 and Psalm 17. The main source of the trouble in Psalm 26 would seem to be these enemies, these evildoers, but there's no specific crisis that is mentioned, which is typically what you find in a lament. There are elements of a wisdom psalm that would connect it with Psalm 1, for instance. We see a contrast between the way of the innocent with the seated gatherings of the wicked. There's also elements of a psalm of praise or a psalm of worship. Particularly as a psalm of worship, it would be connected with psalms like Psalm 15 and Psalm 24. Clean hands surround the altar with praise and dwell in God's house in this psalm. So it does have a few different elements. I would say as a whole, it probably has the most connections with Psalm 25 that is right before it. There are several connections with verses in that psalm. As far as the structure of this psalm goes, it begins and ends with a petitionary prayer, and then it alternates back and forth with confession of innocence and denunciation of evil company. It doesn't have a lot of poetic features. in terms, there's not really a lot of imagery that is used. It does use a theme of walking. You see that occur in verses 1 and 3 and 11, and it sort of leads to verse number 12, where it ends with him standing on solid ground. And then you have that walking theme that contrasts with the sitting of the wicked. You see that particularly in verses 4 and 5. Them, the wicked sitting together, and the innocent walking, and walking in integrity. There's also a contrast in the psalm between the congregation of the gathering of evildoers and the congregation of God's worshipers, as you see in verse number 12. And that's about it as far as the poetic features of the psalm go in particular. Okay, so let's walk through this psalm, 12 verses, not a real long psalm. Judge me, O Lord, for I have walked in mine integrity. I have trusted also in the Lord, therefore I shall not slide. Examine me, O Lord, and prove me. Try my reins and my heart. For thy loving kindness is before mine eyes, and I have walked in thy truth. I have not sat with vain persons, neither will I go in with dissemblers. I have hated the congregation of evildoers, and will not sit with the wicked. I will wash mine hands in innocency. So will I compass thine altar, O Lord, that I may publish with the voice of thanksgiving, and tell of all thy wondrous works. Lord, I have loved the habitation of thy house, and the place where thine honor dwelleth. Gather not my soul with sinners, nor my life with bloody men, in whose hands is mischief, and their right hand is full of bribes. But as for me, I will walk in mine integrity. Redeem me, and be merciful unto me. My foot standeth in an even place. In the congregations will I bless the Lord. All right, so in the first 3 verses of this psalm, we have the introductory or the opening plea of the prayer. It starts out with the phrase, judge me, O Lord. The word that's used for judge here is a word that means to pass sentence, and it often has that sort of a legal connotation with it, like a judge or some authority figure that would be passing a sentence. And if the word in and of itself can be either good or bad. I mean, it can be a sentence of condemnation, or it can be a sentence of exoneration. It's going to depend on the context. So obviously in this context, it's positive. So asking, judge me, O Lord, in a sense, David is asking for vindication. He's asking to be searched and tried and examined by the Lord, and to be vindicated by him. And the very same phrase, judge me, O Lord, appears in Psalm 7 and verse number 8. And we've already noted that there's some similarities between the two Psalms. And Psalm 7:8, he's asking for vindication of judgment between him, the righteous, and between the wicked. And we have a very similar prayer here in Psalm 26. We see in Psalm, beginning in verse 1, we see a confession of innocence. He's walked in his integrity. He's trusted the Lord. He shall not slide, and so on. And confessions of innocence is something that runs through this psalm. And we see this mention of integrity. I've walked in mine integrity. And we see that actually in verse 21 of Psalm 25. We see that there as well as a confession of innocence. Similar to confessions that we see in Psalm 10, verse 12, Psalm 15, verse 2, Psalm 18, verse 23, and Psalm 19, verse 13. So it's all Psalms that we've looked at that come prior to this. And of course, the idea of integrity is the idea of blamelessness, or the idea that you cannot be charged. We don't really use blameless in modern speak today that much, but blameless as it meant in the words used in the translation here, it is that idea of you cannot be charged. It's not an idea it's not a word that is implying an absolute perfection, but an idea that you cannot be charged. So you're generally it's associated with some sort of accusation or some sort of wrongdoing, and being blameless in that regard. He requests in verse 2, using 3 words, examine, prove, and try. And all of those words are very similar words, inviting a thorough testing. The first and the third word that's used there are often words used to speak of testing metal, determining the purity of a metal. And the second word can also be used that way. It can be used in a sense of a more legal examination, of thoroughly being tried and searched out. And you also notice, and this would be a little bit of the imagery that's used here, try my reins and my heart. Literally, that would be my kidneys and my heart, which would be the kidneys, which would be more as the affections or the seat of the emotions, and the heart, which typically in the Old Testament usage stands for the mind or the intellect. And so he's calling for this examination, but it's an examination of the inner man and the inner life of David, not just his outer actions and doings. So he is calling for a thorough examination, an examination that can only come from the Lord, because the Lord alone is the one that can look on the hearts and can test and try our hearts. We as human beings cannot do that. He also mentions in verse 3 that his eyes are fixed on the loving kindness of God. Of course, that's the Hebrew hesed that we've seen a number of times, speaking of that covenant mercy of God, and that David's eyes are fixed upon that, and he is walking in God's truth. When we come to verses 4 and 5, we see this first mention of David's enemies, or at least this group or gathering of evildoers that are certainly a threat to him and are certainly causing him problems. And David is confessing here his innocence in reference to them. He says, I've not sat with vain persons. I didn't go in with the dissemblers. I hated the congregation or the gathering of evildoers. I did not sit with the wicked. So we see a repetition here. Like, all of these terms are similar. They have differences of nuance, obviously. But they're all essentially pointing to the fact that he's saying, I didn't sit down in their gathering. I did not, in other words, I did not associate with them to join in their counsel, to join in their activities. Obviously, this would be contrary to the way of the blessed man that we saw in Psalm 1, who doesn't go in the way of sinners and the seat of the scornful, doesn't sit there, and doesn't go in the way of the counsel of the ungodly, and so on. So this is a contrast in the counsel and the way that David has sought, because he has said very plainly that he's kept God's loving kindness before his eyes, and he's walked in God's truth, and he's walked in integrity. So in other words, he's in essence saying, it's a confession of innocence, that I have shunned the counsel of the ungodly. I've shunned the way of sinners. I've shunned the seat of the scornful. I have sought to walk in your truth, in God's truth and God's counsel. When we look at verses 6 to 8, which stand at the center of this psalm, these verses focus on God's house. This psalm, Psalm 26, is in a group of psalms that refer to God's house. It's one of the commonalities. There's a little run of the psalms here, and one of the commonalities is reference to God's house. So when we look at Psalms 23 to 25 that have come before this psalm, we see the references to God's house, who will approach, who will abide there, that sort of thing. And of course, we would read those things together. We see he mentioned the washing of his hands in innocency, and it reminds us of the requirement of clean hands in Psalm 24 and verse number 4. He speaks of that he will publish with the voice of thanksgiving and tell of all thy wondrous works in verse number 7. And this is, he will compass the altar of the Lord. He will publish these things. The word for publish, it can be translated as hear or as heard. In fact, it's very often translated that way. Here it would have the idea of causing to hear. I will publish. In other words, I will declare. He's referring to, some sort of a declaration to be heard. This is not just something he's going to think, or not just something he's going to speak in private, but this is something that he's going to declare so that it can be heard. The voice of thanksgiving and all thy wondrous works. The word for voice is a word that means to call aloud. And so again, it has the same idea of some sort of public declaration and even a loud declaration so as to be heard. Now, the word for thanksgiving that's used here is a word that means to praise. And typically, this word is a declaration of God's character, His attributes, and or His works. The word really is not used in the way that we would think of as in just the giving of thanks, like that someone may do something for you and you thank them for doing that. The word's not really used that way in the Bible. It typically is used of the praise of God, focusing on some aspect of Him. We will see some thanksgiving here in a little later in the Psalm. He says that He will tell of all of God's wondrous works. And this is a term that can be used for things that are specific, like the Exodus from Egypt. And you can find the word used that way in Psalm 78, for instance, to speak of the wondrous works of God. And it's used in that sort of a specific sense. It's used in a general sense, but even when it's used generally, it means a miraculous act. So when it speaks of these wonderful works, these marvelous works, it's talking about some sort of miraculous act, some sort of extraordinary act of God. So an example would obviously be like the intervention at the Exodus from Egypt. They're passing through the Red Sea and things like that. So it is specifically speaks of the extraordinary acts of God that He does for the deliverance of His people. Obviously, the intent here being that these are praiseworthy acts, and He's going to publish with the voice of thanksgiving and tell all of these acts of God. He talks about coming into the house of God, dwelling in the house of God, and noting that it's a place where God's honor dwells. And the word for honor is the Hebrew kavod, which we have seen a number of times. A lot of times it's translated glory. Sometimes it's translated honor. The word literally means weight, but it has to do with God's glory. We saw in Psalm 19 in verse number 1, this term applied to God. We've seen it more often in the Psalms to this point being used to describe the glory of kingship, the kingship, particularly of the kingship of the Anointed One. But in Psalm 19, Psalm 21, and in Psalm 24, we've seen it used of God. Now in Psalm 24, it's also associated with kingship because we have the 3 verses or 4 verses there that speak of the King of glory entering into the city there in Psalm 24. So this is the place where God's glory dwells, or where God's glory resides. In verses 9 and 10, we have another reference to David's enemies again, or at least evildoers that are giving David, or are a source of problem. And what we see in David's prayer here again is not as much a confession as we saw at the previous time, though it does include that, but it's also the petition, the plea. Don't gather me, or gather not my soul with sinners, nor my life with bloody men, which literally would be, don't take my breath. Don't take my breath with sinners. Don't take my life with bloody men or murderous men. He speaks of their hands being full of bribes and mischief. So he's praying here for, remember as he started out asking for God's judgment, he's praying here for distinction to be made between him and between these bloody men, sinners, those that are full of mischief and bribes. And those are the sort that will not stand in God's judgment. If you remember back to Psalm 1, verses 5 and 6. So in essence, David is acknowledging that they will not stand the judgment of God. So he's asking not to be gathered with them. Don't group me with the wicked and pour out your judgment, because David knows if that would happen, he would not stand. So he's praying for deliverance. He's praying to be delivered from those. He has shunned the community of evildoers. He has shunned their counsel. He has sought out the way of God. So this is the petition for David to be delivered. And then we get to verses 11 and 12. This is the concluding petition of the prayer. And David prays here particularly for redemption. Redeem me. Now that word first occurred in Psalm 25 and verse 22. Redeem Israel, O God, out of all his troubles. Well, David is here praying for redemption, and that word means a ransom or a rescue. And it's a word that requires both a redeemer and a redemption price. That redemption price didn't necessarily always have to be money. It could be money, but it also could be life. And of course, in the case of the Messiah Redeemer, we know that redemption price is his precious blood, as Peter pointed to, not silver and gold from the traditions from their fathers. So he's asking for a redeemer, and he's asking for a redemption price to be paid, that he will be redeemed, that he will be ransomed, that he will be freed. And he also says, and be merciful unto me. And that word for merciful means gracious. It's sometimes translated with the word the word gracious. It's a word that has the idea of granting a favor. So that's what David's praying for. Grant me a favor. It's not something that's due, not something that's owed. It's something that is a gift. It's something that is gracious. In other words, it's something that originates and comes from the goodness of God, the graciousness of God, not anything having to do with what David has earned or accomplished or deserved or is due in any way. So he's asking for redemption essentially as a gift of God's favor bestowed on him. And he ends in verse 12 with that note of confidence. My foot standeth in an even place. In other words, he's standing securely on level ground. His feet have been in danger of slipping before. We saw that like in Psalm 17 and verse number 5. But here, through the grace of God and through his covenant mercy and through his redemption, he stands on solid ground. And he says that he will bless the Lord in the congregations. The word for congregation is just a general word for assembling in the Hebrew. And contextually, it would be the assemblies of the righteous or the assemblies of the redeemed ones. And it's the place where he blesses the Lord from. He blesses the Lord from that assembly. We've seen similar references. Now, the word for bless literally means to kneel. But it's also a word that is used when speaking of blessing the Lord. A lot of times if we would talk about blessing another person, we might think of conferring a blessing on them or giving them something. We might think of Jacob blessing his sons. And when he blesses his sons, he's conferring upon them certain inheritance and certain benefits and things that are being given to them. Obviously, we can't confer any benefits to God. We can't, we can't add anything to him. So when it's used in a sense of blessing the Lord, which is very common in the Psalms, there is where it has more of the idea of giving thanks to God, more of the idea of a gratitude. The idea of kneeling obviously would include a bowing in worship and a thanking of the Lord for what he has done. All right. Before we move on to any interpretation, any questions or anything from that? Okay. Well, let's go to our interpretation. What does Psalm 26 teach? Psalm 26 is one of those places in the Psalms, and we've already encountered some, but it teaches what I'm going to call covenantal righteousness. And I think we can sometimes struggle when we come to a psalm like this and we look at that psalm on its own and we wonder, do David's confessions of innocence and walking in integrity mean that he's sinlessly perfect? And that can be something difficult to weigh out. Well, it doesn't mean that, and I have a few reasons why. We've encountered these confessions of innocence a few times already in the Psalms as we've been going through it. But sometimes we've also encountered the confession of sin, like in Psalm 25, verses 7 and 18. So the Psalms, we have to remember, is a collection of psalms, and they all do stand together. So we can't just isolate one psalm and interpret it as if none of the other psalms exist. So we are informed by other psalms whenever we're looking at any one in particular psalm. So that's one reason why we look at these confessions of innocence, and we know that David is not laying claim to some sort of absolute perfection or sinlessness. And even within this psalm, we have certain indicators to us that show us that that's not the case, that David is claiming a sinless perfection or a self-righteousness. Well, David's acceptance or his vindication that he began praying for in this psalm, you'll notice that it's not based on his perfection. I mean, as you work your way through the text of the psalm, it's not based on his perfection that he's going to be vindicated. I mean, he starts out in the very beginning talking about his trust in the Lord or in Yahweh. That word that means to take refuge in Yahweh. That word that we have seen several times in the Psalms and seen how that it has those covenantal associations. Someone who has put their trust in Yahweh, who has taken refuge in Him, is someone who is in a covenant relationship with Him. So David is praying from that standpoint, that he is in a covenant relationship with Yahweh. David keeps his eyes, according to verse 3, he keeps his eyes fixed on what? On Yahweh's hesed, on His covenant mercy. David doesn't have his eyes fixed on the good that he has done. He doesn't have his eyes fixed on some sort of a balance where he's trying to outweigh his bad works with his good works. He doesn't have his eyes fixed on anything like that. He has his eyes fixed on Yahweh's covenant faithfulness. And then by the end of this psalm, he's praying for grace. And he's praying for redemption by God's grace. And again, these are not terms that are associated with self-righteousness in any way whatsoever, but always associated with that, what you might call that one-way salvation by grace from God. So we see those kind of indicators within the text of the psalm itself. Now, typically, confessions of innocence, as we encounter them, and we'll encounter more of them in the Psalms, we've encountered a few already. Confessions of innocence typically refer to some specific charge. And we've seen that in some of the prior Psalms already. So that when he is speaking of innocence, he is referring in regard to some specific accusation, some specific charge that's been made against him. Now, we don't have any specific accusations mentioned here, but I do believe that from what we've seen in other Psalms and as we read them together, that there's good reason to infer that. There's good reason to believe that there's some sort of specific accusation when David is confessing innocence and inviting the judgment, the scrutiny and the judgment of God. And really, when you think about it, that in and of itself tells us something. Because only someone who is standing in the safety of a covenant relationship with God could invite the scrutiny and judgment of God, because otherwise that judgment will mean their destruction. So that the only way that you could pray for the judgment of God, the vindication of God to come to you, would have to be from a place of that covenant relationship with God. Also, it's clear that David's faith in this psalm is in God's covenant faithfulness. And even if we think back to the covenant with Abraham and how that it teaches imputed righteousness by faith. We looked at that in as Paul brought that out in Romans, Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. That's all the way back in the Abrahamic covenant. So in other words, it's not as though David doesn't understand imputed righteousness by faith. It's not as though David doesn't understand the role of faith in the covenant relationship that he has with Yahweh. It's not that David thinks that he has to keep the law in order to be righteous and be accepted with God. He does understand that. And what we see in this psalm also, when we see David talking about walking in his integrity and walking in the truth and all that sort of thing, David really is committed to walking in God's word and God's ways. He really is committed to that. So what we have here then is a sinner pursuing holiness and praying to God for that pursuit. So that's a good way to see this psalm and to see this psalm teaching us about covenantal righteousness. This psalm also, Psalm 26, also teaches God's sovereignty. And we've seen this in other similar psalms. Ultimately, it's God who is the judge and who justifies those who believe in him and condemns those who do not. So that, as David prays, judge me, O Lord, and as he's appealing to God throughout this psalm, he obviously understands that God ultimately is the judge, and he will condemn or he will pardon, and that's ultimately his judgment. So David asked, like in verses 9 and 10, to be distinguished from the wicked in judgment. In other words, God is the one that determines outcomes. In essence, David prays, God, if you just gather me up with the wicked and judge me by that standard, David knows he's not going to stand. He knows that he's going to be destroyed. He doesn't have enough righteousness before God to be able to survive such a judgment. So God is the one who determines the outcomes. Okay, that brings us to the messianic hope here in Psalm 26. Now, obviously, any time that you have these covenantal references and particularly mentions of redemption in a psalm, you're going to have a psalm that's pointing to the Messiah. And especially when we read Psalm 26 in connection with Psalms 23 to 25 before it, we understand the messianic connections with dwelling in God's house and that being the place where his glory abides and dwells. So Psalm 23, those who trust in God are shepherded to his house by the great shepherd that we obviously understand to be the Messiah, to be Christ. In Psalm 24, the congregations gathered to his house are those vindicated from their enemies, especially the remnant of Jacob being restored to Jerusalem with the coming of the King of Glory. And in Psalm 25, we have a picture of that gathered and restored Israel who have waited on the Lord, and their enemies have been put to shame, and truth flows out from Jerusalem, providing that solid ground. So Psalm 26, in essence, zooms in to one of that crowd, to one of that congregation, in this case particularly to David, but individually those in covenant relationship with Yahweh could see themselves there. He's walked a dangerous path, but he has been brought safely to stand on that solid level ground, to be joined with the congregation, blessing the Lord in the presence of his glory. So the psalm is future looking in that aspect. All right, any questions on the interpretation? Okay, application. Two of these. Understanding Psalm 26 helps us as modern readers to understand that not all suffering is the direct result of sin. David is obviously suffering affliction here. It doesn't It doesn't maybe take as much of the center stage as it does in some other Psalms. But in other words, as modern readers, we read this and understand that not all suffering is the direct result of some sin in your life. And sometimes people will try to convince you that that is the case. It's not always the case. Might it be the case? It might be the case, but it's not always the case. David, like Job, was at times a righteous sufferer. And really, when we follow the Psalms of David, we see this. There are times when he confesses that he's not a righteous sufferer. He is suffering as a direct result of his sin. And he's very honest about that in some of these Psalms. Well, this is a case where, as far as we take the text of the Psalm itself, David does appear to be a righteous sufferer. And so it does help us understand that sort of situation, and even our own prayers at such times as that. Number two, understanding Psalm 26 helps us understand to trust in the Lord without wavering. And David used that word in verse 1, therefore I shall not slide. The idea of wavering. And I think we get a picture in this psalm that David's not wavering in his faith. He's praying, he's asking God for certain things. He's obviously concerned about the enemies and those that have surrounded him. But we will always have suffering of various degrees, and we will always have adverse circumstances. Sometimes that might be in the form of direct opposition from the enemies. Sometimes it may come in some other forms, but we're always going to be dealing, as long as we're in this life and we're awaiting that redemption of the body, we're awaiting the redemption of the creation with the return of Christ. We're always going to have suffering and adverse circumstances. So a psalm like this helps us understand how to trust in the Lord without wavering. Ultimately, those who trust Him will be vindicated and will be gathered to be in His presence. And like David, that's where our eyes need to be fixed. Need to be fixed on that covenant mercy of God. Need to be fixed on His truth. Need to be fixed on walking in His way and shunning the counsel of the ungodly. All right, that's all I have on Psalm 26. Any questions at all about Psalm 26?
What was it you said that honor literally meant?
That's the Hebrew word kavod, and it literally means weight. Yeah. So it's like it communicates the like, you know, you're a person of great weight. Not talking about your physical weight, but just that there's gravity about you. There's a sort of an authority or a nobility or something of your presence. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? All right. Well, then we will be dismissed with a word of prayer. Almighty Father in heaven, Lord, we do thank you tonight for this opportunity that we've had to look into your word. Father, we just praise you for your covenant faithfulness, how psalm after psalm after psalm, we're just being reminded of your covenant faithfulness. Father, we're being reminded time and time again that if we have put our trust in you, if we've taken refuge in you, Father, we do stand on solid ground. We don't have to fear your judgment. We don't have to fear your wrath. And we do not have to fear, because we do have a perfect righteousness in Jesus Christ, one that will bear the trial by fire, one that will bear the closest of scrutiny and examination, and will be found flawlessly righteous before you. Father, thank you for that. Lord, I do pray that you would help to strengthen us as we face adversity, as we face difficulty, as we face suffering, as we even face the opposition of enemies. Help us that we not waver. Help our eyes to be fixed upon you and upon your word, realizing that this life is very short and fleeting. It's just momentary, but there's an eternal weight of glory that is to come, Father. And I pray that you help us to look forward to that. Lord, go with us to our homes tonight. Keep us throughout the rest of this week. I pray that you would prepare hearts and minds for services on the Lord's day. It's in Jesus' holy and precious name that I pray. Amen.
Right? Look, the same and separate. Our bag and you're the white.